Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Ellie. That was an amazing presentation. So if you look at your program, it's going to tell you that I'm going to show excerpts from several different bodies of work and talk through my aesthetic choices and strategies and distribution, and I'm not going to do that. I'm sort of going to do that, but not really. I'm only going to talk about one project. This book I did on sexual violence with a protagonist I've known over 25 years. And I think I want to do that because we're in this cultural, political moment where women and girls are wanting to tell their Me Too stories, to call out their perpetrators, to try and find a moment or shred of justice. And what do we demand of these survivors? How can we tell their stories maybe in a safer, more ethical way? In the United States, the past couple of years, we've watched a Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, be accused of sexual assaults by several women. It was frequently noted in the press how poised and credible and accomplished these women were. One had a doctorate, another one had several national security clearances, and they were kind of the perfect victims, right? And what about the women who aren't perfect victims, who aren't powerful, who maybe never became the women they wanted to be precisely because someone did something so harmful to them that it traumatized and destabilized them the rest of their life? How do we honor these women in our storytelling? So I've tried to do this not as a journalistic outsider, but as a friend and artistic collaborator with a woman I met when she was a teenager in London in 1990, and I was a young photographer visiting the city. I went to London from New York City with this very vague notion of photographing the end of the Maggie Thatcher era. The UK was experiencing many of the same things the United States experienced after the neoliberal years of Ronald Reagan. And London was populated by hundreds of street kids living in the West End. And so I would roam those streets at night and during the day, just meeting and talking to kids. And one night I met this girl banging on the door of a hostel, screaming, "Let us in," and her name was Cathy Wish. She said to me, "Who are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a photographer from New York," and she got very interested and wanted to know all about New York City. And I basically spent the next couple of weeks following her around as she tried to get into shelters, as she would panhandle on the street. She revealed bits and pieces of her story. She was a runaway, she had been in foster home, she had been adopted by a white family in the south of England. She was frightened because a circle of men, perpetrators, were around her. She smoked crack, which was very unusual for London at the time, and she started to tell me about intimate experiences where men had done very violent things to her. And she was terrified. So before I returned to New York, I gave her my address and my phone number, and I said she could stay in touch with me. I went back to New York City. I showed these pictures to magazine editors, and they had absolutely no interest. And so I put them in a box in my closet and just didn't really think about the pictures anymore. Cathy wrote me, for the millennials out there, this is how people used to communicate. An aerogram. She would reveal more of her story. And then about 8 months later, she either wrote or phoned, I forgot now, it's so long ago, and said, "Hey, Nina, I won this contest for homeless kids. I played the piano, and I won all this money, and I want to come and visit New York City. Can I stay with you for a couple of days?" So I was kind of like, whenever I tell this story, I'm always suspicious that people in the audience think, how could you have done that? But actually, it was kind of not so unusual in a way for people to say, oh yeah, you can crash at my place. And she seemed able to survive on the streets of London, so I said she could stay for a couple of days. And this is her view of West 84th Street. And I was living in this tiny apartment with my boyfriend at the time. I'd showed her around New York City. And she slept on a cot with her teddy bear. And then she had a nightmare. And I took some pictures of her nightmare. And in her nightmare, she's clearly being assaulted. And then I took about a half a roll of film and stopped. And I felt like I was crossing a line and doing something wrong. I put the camera down. And then like the next day or two, she had a flashback. Mental illness is not an exotic thing for me. I grew up with a sister who is severe bipolar disease. I understand what mental illness is about, but I had never seen anything like this. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know who I was. Her eyes were rolling back. She was afraid. She was running to the door. I lived on the 8th floor. I thought she was going to jump out the window. I got very nervous. After about 10 minutes, I kind of helped talk her out of it so that she knew where she was. And I realized that she couldn't stay with me. I was afraid for her being there, and I really wasn't equipped to help her in any way. So I convinced her that she really needed to go back to London, and I drove her to Kennedy Airport the following days, and she went back to London. And then she would continue to write me, and over time she sent me pages from a diary, a contemporaneous diary that she had kept, that talked about the flashbacks and the abuse. Basically, it's a story of sexual violence, child pornography, okay? And at some point, she sent me a whole bunch of medical documents, and I just stashed them in a drawer. Her main perpetrator was a man named Mark Holman, which may or may not be his real name. In any case, in 1973, she was staying at a place called Lorne House, which is now a fancy condominium, but at that time in London was a place for addicts seeking to recover. And she had been kidnapped and raped, and she met officers from Scotland Yard, and one of them told her she should leave England. He gave her a couple £100, and she showed up in New York City. And has never been back. And she became a ward of the state of New York, and now goes by the name of Kimberly Stevens. I stopped photographing her, except for a few pictures here and there, which I keep in my family album. For better or worse, she was not any more a journalistic subject, but a person in my life. And I would help as best as I could to try and navigate her way around a very harsh New York City, through psychiatric facilities, court system, etc. I became her de facto next of kin. And so when she came to New York City, she was eventually placed in some psychiatric facilities, residential ones, and she was always trying to tell her story. She would do it through drawings. These are her drawings. It was part of her recovery. She was trying to tell a story that she was told for years that she should not tell, that would be dangerous for her to tell. So these are all her drawings. And she'd send me these drawings. And so I, in fact, became her archivist over the years, and I would keep the things that she would collect, because she was always trying to collect evidence of what had happened to her and what was happening to her. And then maybe my most central role was of archivist in some ways, because if you are a person who's experiencing serious trauma or an addict or living on the street, you have no place to put your stuff, right? Stuff that may be important for you. And so I kept her stuff with no intention of doing anything with it other than at some point, if she wanted it, giving it back to her. And whatever apartment I went to in New York, I moved to in New York City, I would bring the box of Kim's stuff. For any of you who are from New York, you might know that in the early 1990s, New York was filled with crack cocaine. It was on nearly every street corner. Sometimes street corners had 10, 15 dealers. Whereas in London, it might have cost, say, 10, 15, even 20 pounds to get high. In New York, it was $2.50, or for a female, the equivalent blowjob, right? And so crack addiction, HIV, forced sexual intercourse were all connected. And I could see her future in a New York that was becoming increasingly more brutal and less forgiving, and especially as a Black woman in a racist city. And so it was, okay, addiction, HIV, prison. And that's kind of what happened. So in 2008, she was arrested on a kind of a trumped-up drug charge, and she quickly made a plea bargain, which was, if you send me to drug treatment, I will plead guilty. So she's sent to Rikers Island. Rikers Island I like to call the Guantanamo of Queens. It's a notoriously violent, brutal detention center. At that time housed over 10,000 people, most of whom have never been convicted of any crime, but are just too poor to make bail. So she was put in Rikers Island, and she promptly tried to kill herself. And I visited her at the prison hospital, chained to the bed. And so the authorities had a peculiar dilemma. She was no longer a drug patient. She was now a psych patient. And in New York City, believe it or not, drug use and mental illness are considered two different things. Whereas, in fact, you talk to any addict or any person suffering from mental illness, or you talk to Kim and she'll say, I turned to drugs because of my trauma, and then I became more traumatized because of the life of being a drug addict. And so they are interwoven, and this was consistently an issue with her care. She did eventually make it out of Rikers Island after 6 months, and this was her first apartment. Before entering Rikers, she was diagnosed with HIV, which in the past was a death sentence, but in New York City now is actually can potentially be a plus, because it allows you assistance that you wouldn't normally get if you weren't HIV positive. And there are actually people in New York City today intentionally getting themselves infected so that they can get housing assistance. So this was a one tiny room, shared bathroom apartment on West 36th Street in Manhattan. So at this point in time, we're now in early 2009, where I thought she was gonna die. She was so thin, she was so sick. And I thought, look at me, here I'm this photographer, and I don't have any pictures of her. And I need to start taking pictures of her. Because she had been a central person in my life, and I thought she was gonna die. So I started photographing her, I started recording her, I started videotaping her, never with any intention to show them to editors. I'd never talked to editors about this story ever. And this went on and on and on. I want to be very clear, I am an active participant in this story. This picture exists because I brought her to this hospital. Okay, I am not a neutral bystander. Things are happening in the course of this story because I am actively involved. And I am not putting this out there as a prescription for all you storytellers out there that this is what you need to do, or this is the only way to do ethical work. I'm just saying this is my story. Okay. Kim had written her own story down in the course of her various treatments, over about 100 pages of what happened to her in her life, and it's a very long and tangled tale. And she had always wanted to do a book. And in 2014, I got a residency for 2 weeks for people working on stories of sexual violence. And so it brought together a group of artists and filmmakers and journalists. And I thought, okay, maybe me and Kim can make something together. And I brought all the material, all the stuff in the boxes that I'd saved of hers, all of the stuff I had photographed, and I spent 2 weeks looking through everything, through things that I had never looked at before, because I didn't really want to read her diaries. I really didn't want to read all these medical reports. I had kind of shielded myself from all the details of the story. And then there were some parts of the story which I weren't sure if were true, and so I was looking for verifications in the different documents and reports. And after spending, 10 days alone in this room, I made a kind of architecture of what I thought could potentially be a book, and I invited my colleagues into the studio space, and I was like, do you think there's something here that might be of interest to the greater public, or is it just mine and Kim's story and we should keep it to ourselves? And so they encouraged me to continue on, and me and Kim set about making this book together. There is nothing in this book that she has not agreed to, that she doesn't feel safe with, that she didn't want. She is a photo editor, she is a collaborator, she is a designer. And it is the only way I would ever have approached any of this material. Okay, so this is a picture of her when she was 9. She had drawn what she called her yes-no book. This is an explanation of this book. I didn't have a make-believe friend when I was small to tell me the best thing to do. I had this big book in mind that would flick through the pages on its own, and there would be the answer straight in front of me with a bright glow, yes or no, simple and safe. Shall I run away or just stay? And whatever the answer, I knew deep down that I was doing the right thing. So it was her moral compass in life. I photographed her passport picture. I rephotographed it many different ways. It became a kind of running theme through the book. She used to say to me, Nina, if I die, you can talk to me through the moon, and I started photographing moons. And her passport picture kind of looks like a moon. There'd be notes to me. This was a suicide note. We would slap her drawings on my pictures. What you don't see in this book are images of her smoking crack or humiliating herself, except for the very first picture you see of her smoking crack in London. And it's not because I didn't have access to these situations. I could have photographed anything I wanted. I didn't want to see it, and I didn't feel any reason to show it because it wasn't the story I was trying to tell. And I think it's hugely important that when we're talking about stories of addiction, violence, what we don't show is just as important as what we choose to show. So our work is a collaborative autobiography. She is the protagonist, a co-narrator, photo editor. But I am also a media professional. So what's my role? I sought to verify pieces of her story. I went back to England. I talked to her counselors. I talked to people who knew her. I visited her hometown, little town in southern England. This was the actual phone booth she used to run away to call for help when things were happening in her home that were hurting her. So as a photographer, I'm also well aware, right? Media representations of addiction, poverty, and trauma can be stigmatizing and stereotyping. They can be reductive. And so what did I want to emphasize about her? Because in some ways, this was then my role. What did I want people to know about her? That she was a woman, like so many others, who actually works hard every day to keep it together and find a place of love and safety. That she's a survivor, desperate for human connection. And I would ask her about moments when people were actually kind to her. Because if you walk in New York City now, if I just walk the 2 blocks from my apartment to the subway, I will encounter 5 people at least every day who are so messed up, so mentally ill, so distraught. And we don't even notice these people anymore in New York City. So these are some of the nice things, the nice episodes, the nice people that she encountered. It was kind of crowded in the train, but there was a space, and this lady said, "Come and sit down next to me for a minute." And I thought, oh no, here we go. She's going to give me a lecture about rehab. But she didn't. She just wanted to talk to me. She said she had seen me for years. I told her my favorite color and that I liked animals and that one day I wanted to work with kids and that I was born in England and I should just leave it at that because the rest is a long story. There was this other lady, I think she lived right near the station. One day around rush hour, coming home from work time, she came up to me and smiled. That smile took my hunger away and I felt like a human being. So I would go to that station around that time when I was real sad, just for that smile. It gave me courage and the strength to carry on. And this is my picture of loneliness. When we first met, I didn't feel so separate from her situation. I was a teenager who did a whole lot of drugs, and I kind of knew a little bit about that life. And I felt like we could walk down the street together and it made sense. But then she came to New York and her addiction got worse and her situation got worse and worse and my career went like that. And I became a white successful woman and she became a black marginalized woman. And our friendship was almost in defiance of these categories, but at some point in time, we would leave. We would say bye, and I'd go one way at the 110th Street station, and she'd go another way. In the book are also our text messages, and here's her selfie. And we made some pictures together. We cooked them up and dreamed them up, and this was in Central Park. And this was very exciting for me because I never did this as a photographer before. So in the end, I aim through the design and combination of images and text to present not just a fiercely brave survivor with a harrowing story to tell, but a woman who is deeply reflective about loads of things, who makes beautiful drawings and plays exquisite piano, who's not just a subway panhandler or someone shuffling through Times Square. And where's my cursor? Before the book came out and before we put it to bed, I was very nervous. And I used to ask her during the process, "Kim, are you sure you want to do this?" Because I knew it would probably be me standing in front of you or in the public defending this work, telling her story. And she said, "Yes, I want to do it. Yes, Nina, stop it. I want to do it. I want to do it." And so I actually said, "I need you to write down for me why you want to do it." And she wrote 10 pages. And some of those pages are published in the book. And I really encourage all you journalists out there who are working on stories with people in difficult situations to ask them what their intention is in talking to you. And the consent isn't a one-time conversation. It is a multiple conversations. And it's not simply, "Oh yeah, I'm going to get them to sign this paper and they're going to give away all their rights and I got the paper." That is not the kind of consent you want. At least it's not the kind of consent I have learned to feel is authentic consent. So I just wanted to kind of leave. I have one short little video to show, but I wanted to leave with this one thing that Kim wrote in her diary, which even though she wrote it a long time ago, I still thought was something kind of timeless. I remember things, well, most of them so clearly in my mind. My eyes used to be so big and wide open, taking in everything around me like a video recorder. But now they don't want to. They look around and care, half closed, hoping to not see anything that hurts. And when they do, they turn away quickly. My eyes are streetwise, and if you look closely, you will see the pain in my eyes. My eyes are the ways into memories of fear, and everything I've seen somewhere in there is the real me. 3 years ago, Kim got into a supportive housing in Lower Manhattan, a pretty good place. And she has a cat. We used to joke, how's our story gonna end? You're either gonna die or get a dog, because she was obsessed with getting a dog. So she didn't die, and she got a cat named Snacks. Anyway, we wanted to make some happier pictures. And this isn't Jonah's story where we're up on that like pink line up here, like life for someone who's traumatized, who's PTSD and everything else goes like this, right? And will always go like this with maybe more ups than downs. But she started to go to NA, and she's had 30 days and then 60 days and then 90 days of being clean and serene, and then the last bit was 111 days, and that's remarkable. And so I want to end on kind of an up note, and I have a little video. I made a bunch of videos over the summer, and I'm just going to play you the very end of those videos.
The piano is amazing.
Hey, Kim, you remember the piano that you said that when you get clean, you're going to go and play it? Remember the piano in
Over there?
50th Street?
Yeah, I should go in there one day, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know.
You gotta tell me.
But I don't know whether to go in there looking bummy and then play it, or go in there, because I like to prove people wrong. I love that. Because when I do the same thing, and then when I learn and when people teach me the way I'm thinking is wrong, I'd be like, wow, you're right.
You should decide, do you want to go in there to prove something to someone else, or do you want to go there just to go and play the piano? And then you can decide what outfit you're going to wear.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe I could do both.
Right.
Right? Thank you so much.